So that means I will give the floor to Rens de Man, who was an active participant and also organizer of this conference. And he participated in workshop 3, which was focusing on what's happening at the grassroots level. And Rens has also prepared a short PowerPoint with key findings.
Yes, I'm waiting for the technical issues to be done. Well, let's say to start with that I'm a happy man after heard all the presentations and all the sessions. There's really rich material from that. But at the same time, I'm now facing the difficulty of selecting and summarizing the key points from it, and it's kind of a hard task. So what we did is to use the summary that was used by Lida Schijwels. She came up with a wrap-up this morning with a division of 5 points that are connecting levels, connecting people, connecting sectors, connecting countries, and connecting political agendas. These are, according to us, the key issues we have to talk about. All the cases we discussed beforehand revolved around these issues. First, with regard to connecting levels, the range of actors is broadening and new types of actors are joining in. I'm also reading, sorry, from the screen because it's also the first time I'm seeing it actually. So we need to create spaces for new actors to join and to meet and to establish trust. And in that process, NGOs can operate something like the glue between the levels, as they are not fixed within a certain scheme yet. So we need to involve the top level and the right ministry we also should embrace grassroots initiatives and ideas. But at the same time, what has also come forward is that, well, by just establishing a participatory organization or another vehicle, you're not taking away the power disparities between the actors. And I think you should acknowledge and be very clear that there's no such thing as a network society. There are always differences, but I think we should try to sensitize the actors which come together in a participatory organization, that there are power differences, but that we are having a common interest to talk about. Next, please. So participation, public participation is key to sustainable cooperation. What we find is that the language, and this has also been said in the working group of you, Peter, that people don't understand each other often. If you start using a technical language, it's not understood by the people at the grassroots level. At the same time, diplomats won't understand also the technical language. So we need to find a common ground. And with regard to that, mediation skills can help to build this connection, to see what the standpoint from other people, and to recognize what their interests are and what their viewpoints are. And in that way, we can build trust and integrity. And that must be also the starting point from the donor perspective, that we need to be very clear on our own agendas. When we are going to other countries, we're going there with certain interests, and we should be very clear about these interests. Next slide, please. Key is that we come up with connections with different sectors, because the problems to water issues are often outside the water domain itself. So we need to team up with organizations to team up with the energy sector to come up with solutions. Because if they recognize the importance of water in their domain, we can really make a change. So cooperation can form an entry point for cooperation. Oh, well, that's funny. I think I'll leave it with this one. Next slide, please. What is important to recognize that water is not accepting boundaries, and it's crossing boundaries, and by doing so, the problems are also crossing boundaries. I leave this one. You can read it. What to me is very important lesson that I will take home is that politics are in command. Political will is essential to establish change. We can have nice meetings all together, but in the end, it are the most powerful in the end who decide what is going to happen. So we need to sensitize and be aware of the interests of politicians. And in that way, we can match money and politics to establish change. Next slide, please. And I would like to finish with a quote from Gandhi. There's enough water for everyone's needs, but not for everyone's greed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rens. May I now invite Shiv Mukherjee, I hope I pronounce it correctly, Jane Matchwick, and Shafiqul Islam to come to the front for initial round of comments. Mr. Islam, is he still around? No, I think we will start this session without. So, Mr. Matchwick, Miss Matchwick, I'm so sorry. You are from an NGO and you do a lot of work at the grassroots level. What will you take home from Working Group 3 from the sessions? What were key lessons that you encountered?
Okay. First of all, I found it a very enriching experience to be here for 2 days, so thank you for the opportunity. First of all, I learnt that my own organisation, Wetlands International, actually does water diplomacy. I didn't know that before, but listening to all the explanations, I realised that this is exactly what we do in many river basins, and as a result, we should pay far more attention to recording and learning from what we're doing in terms of the process, the social process that we're involved in, and not only talk about the actual results, like influencing the water sharing, which is what we do. So that's very useful. I noted a few risks and also some opportunities, and I see they more or less balance each other. So I thought I'd share a couple of those. Yesterday, we were told there's a pathway, that it goes from information, institutions to infrastructure. And that the developing countries, there's the most urgent need, and yet they're in the worst position to follow that pathway. And we've heard an awful lot, I think, about how that pathway should ideally happen. But what I notice is that there's a big difference in reality between what should happen and what actually does happen. And what does happen, especially in developing countries, is to jump to the infrastructure. To the end of the pathway without the institutional systems, mechanisms being there, and without the information sharing being there. So I think we should recognise that is what is going on, and that's a big risk. The gap between the top-down and the bottom-up approach has been mentioned, and what I think Group 3 started to unravel was the challenge that exists in terms of addressing that gap through development aid and through, for example, loans from banks. How to actually tackle, how to resource in one loan program a top-down approach which links with a bottom-up approach. How to make that happen is really quite a challenge. Thirdly, I did note that environment was very much on the margins of all the discussions, and it seems that the whole issue of continuing environmental degradation and what that means in terms of reduced water storage capacity, for example, what it means in terms of exacerbated floods and droughts risks, as long as that's not brought into the equation and not brought into these discussions more strongly, it's a very big risk. And this comes up also in the technical exchange between the developed world and the developing countries. It's all very well to promote room for the rivers. I'm a big fan of that approach, but I think the main message that ought to come across is that, you know, the loss of the floodplains in the first place, it was a mistake. It was a very costly mistake in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, it's possible to put that right, but there's no way on the Nile or the Niger, for example, if this kind of infrastructure route goes ahead, that you can reverse it. It's too expensive, it's not practical. So these kinds of lessons from this and other countries, I think, also ought to come forward. Some of the opportunities, I think we heard that the private sector in particular is getting more interested in tackling water risks, that they're becoming more sensitized to the environmental and social reputational risks. And this is a major opportunity, particularly in terms of linking those risks with a real business case for sustainable solutions. So that was something I thought that could be brought into the discussion more. And also we heard so many fantastic practical grassroots solutions. The opportunity to scale those up through investments, perhaps not just through major investments, but using local banks, local institutions. That's something that was given some emphasis here. And in that context, as has been mentioned, the role of NGOs could be, or is crucial, in helping to forge new alliances across the different scales, but also between the sectors, with the private sector and government. This brokering role was mentioned, and of course that role needs more support to be effective. So those were the key points that I would take back to my organisation and the networks that I work with.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I perhaps ask, is your organisation also in an NGO coalition campaigning for increasing attention for water in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals? And what do you see, because you are very active on the ground, huh? And what would be the value to have world leaders agreeing at the meta level such goals for your daily operations and activities on the ground?
It's true, we are very active on the ground, but one of the reasons we're active on the ground is because we don't like to talk about things that we're not actually involved with. But we're also very active at the global policy level and at the national policy level. So yes, we're very much in favour of water being a sustainable development goal with the right targets and sub-targets that link critically across to all the other goals, whether it's disaster risk reduction or food or health or whatever. So we're very much in support of that, and we bring our own case experiences from the field, where we're working with the communities, but also with the government, also with the private sector, also with the research institutions, in exactly this broker role. Okay,
thank you very much. Then we will continue with the next speaker, former ambassador of India to the Netherlands, Shiv Makeye. I hope I pronounced it somewhat. Going back to the quote of Mahatma Gandhi. Is water an issue for cooperation? Is there enough water, or do you see it from your experience mainly as a topic for greed?
Try and answer that. I was hoping I'd simply say ditto and sit down, but...
Please use the microphone.
Yes, I think Gandhi was right for India and Gandhi was right for the world. Sorry. There are two schools of thought in India. I mean, I'm no water expert. I belong to that much maligned diplomatic group here, not a politician. The two schools are basically that we have among the richest usable water resources in the world, and that we've, with extraordinary efficiency, destroyed them by not implementing some of the best laws in the world and letting things slide, as a result of which we are now spending enormous sums of money and effort in trying to clean up polluted rivers, even trying to do something about cleaning up polluted groundwater in a country where there are river systems that can easily serve the whole country with our 1.2 billion population, which is a number difficult to comprehend by many. So yes, he was right. There's enough for our needs, but not enough for greed. And there's also, if I can go straight down into your main question on what I take away from this, to put it extremely briefly, I've found it exactly as you said, an extremely enriching experience, and I mean that sincerely. The level of knowledge and expertise that exists and that was on display and visible during this conference, and the heart and the compassion that went with it, which I think is a very important element in the exercises the people here are involved in, otherwise they would not have been involved in it, is not just encouraging, it is humbling. I am with Mr. Anthony Earl on this. It cannot just stop here at the level of, with the amount of knowledge that is already there. I think we have the answers to everything in terms of what needs to be done. The next step is to do it. And to do it, I think let's start using the instruments we already have, exactly as you mentioned. I've always felt that, there was another philosopher, Cardinal Newman, who said, if we wait to do something until we can do it perfectly, we'll never do it.
Or when we have the full information.
I think he's absolutely right when he said that we shouldn't be scared of using the instruments that we have simply because they may not be ideal or do the entire job. I think this kind of conference, this kind of knowledge that exists in this room and beyond should now be put to use. How it should be put to use perhaps is the next logical conference, or whatever method is devised to carry this process forward into action. Somewhere I read among the papers that were presented about an action point, a set of action points, an action plan. And the operative word there, as far as I'm concerned, strange as it might sound from a person who spent his professional life in government, is action. Next, just a couple of points. There are 100,000 points to mention, but the ones that I would like to emphasize, just a couple more. I was the one that talked about politics being in command, as a result of which I was almost mugged in the morning. But I repeat that. Government is the key interlocutor in this. When in transboundary issues, whether of water or of land or whatever, the final signature is that of the government, especially when you're talking of democratic countries and even when you're not. So sensitizing the government of where you're working is extremely important. The reason I'm happy to be in IUCN is because they not only do that, they've actually embedded, as I said in the session, they've actually embedded government officials, retired government officials within the organization so that that task is made easier, more accountable, more transparent. To be fair to the politicians, and they have a lot to answer for. I served in Nepal, where water is a huge issue. Nepal has arguably the largest after Canada, and the largest unutilized hydropower potential, anywhere between 50,000 and 80,000 megawatts. It would be the richest country in South Asia if it got its act together on that, but it won't. Continues to shoot itself in the foot because of political squabbling. Even if that were not the case, even if you had a very caring and a very efficient government, that government would have to, and please realize there's a government, and all of you know that, but it hasn't been mentioned here. I just want to set the record straight, if you'll forgive the commercial, for the politicians. They have to manage and balance different vested interests. I mean, in India today, there's a huge fight between mining, which is a huge part of our GDP in many states, not all states, but many states, and something that has become extremely important politically in India, which is environmental issues, with a very tough ministry. So project after project has been stopped because the miners want to mine, and the environmental ministry wants to stop them. And the laws are, our constitution and the laws are in favor of the environment. So they have to balance. It is an extremely difficult task for the politician and the government to balance all kinds of competing vested interests. And relating it to the water issue, it's important for experts to therefore sensitize not just to sensitize the governments, but to point out to them how the road ahead can be obtained in a sort of a win-win situation, that a gain in one is not a loss in the other. So when we are talking of educating diplomats, I think experts have to be trained in diplomacy as well. Otherwise, we will continue to have conferences, excellent conferences like this one, and not much change, particularly for the poor and the underprivileged, who are actually the sufferers. In Nepal, I was talking about the upper middle class and the rich don't suffer, they order tankers. The other thing, just a small point which I think is important, is we're talking of hydro-diplomacy, the diplomacy of water, in terms of its different levels. But at every level, I'd like to stress, just like water, as was pointed out right from the beginning in every session, water flows and does not respect boundaries. So does foreign policy in every sector. Foreign policy is dynamic. The foreign policy of European countries today is not the foreign policy of European countries 60 years ago. So the foreign policy will go along with the realities on the ground. And it is again a job of the experts to point out how best to utilize this, to go ahead better rather than let things slide and become worse. Finally, just a thought that occurred to me. There's been so much wisdom and knowledge and expertise that I've been witness to over the last couple of days. I was wondering how institutionally this most important subject, I mean, water is like air, without it there's no life, could be shared so that, well, I mean, the PR word would call it replicating success. If this could be shared, if success stories could be shared, if this could be using modern tools of communication, which are very sophisticated now, using the social media or whatever, or whatever the experts decide, to share this information so that it's available to every country, to every NGO, to everyone working in this field, so that the experience of one could lead to replicating that success story. Nothing succeeds like success, as they say. And a success story is the best catalyst for taking this whole crucial human endeavor ahead.
Okay.
That's all, thanks.
Thank you very much, and also thank you for making this plea for politics. Coming from the greatest democracy of the world, I think it's important, and also to realize that political preferences can change, and sometimes that the underlying interests can also change, and the values can be weighted in a different way after a certain amount of time. Okay, I wanted to invite Rens to join us and to ask the audience if there's any questions to the panelists or to Rens. Please, Ms. Whitmer.
Want me to use my voice or a microphone?
Please.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Lesja Whitmer. And I had one question and two comments. I was a little bit surprised by the list of who to connect to. Because I am missing a group. And if I take people as all of us, including civil society and NGOs, then they're there. But I don't see a distinction between a political agenda and government officials. Because to me, that's a lot of times that's not the same thing. There are a lot of experts in ministries that are part of the government, but I wouldn't call them a politician. So that's a question. Did they got lost, or are they not seen as a player in this field? The second thing is that I was surprised by the conclusion that we have to figure out what the politicians want. I would think that if we as water people have self-esteem, we will tell the politicians which way we want them to go, and then we promise we'll keep voting for them. But not the other way around. So this is what surprises me always. People say, oh, there needs to be political will, and then it's like it's something outside of ourselves. But it's us that create political will. So that's the second remark. The third one has to do with the Sustainable Development Goals. Mm-hmm. There are very large groups of NGOs and civil society who are very much in favor of a dedicated goal on water, with the different targets encompassing the whole water agenda. Let that be very clear. And then a lot of people, like you, say, oh, but we also have to link up with the other agendas. So I'm putting a question to you. There is a very formidable speaker. He is Assistant Deputy Secretary General of the UN, tasked with energy agenda. And he comes into the water people meetings and says, I will give you a water target in my energy goal. Okay, everybody happy. Would it be not better not to say we're going to mainstream ourselves, because then we're gone. If you're everywhere, you're nowhere. But to do the same thing and go to the other sectors and say, we will give you a food and an energy and whatever target in the water goal.
Mm-hmm. Okay, nobody wants to be coordinated or mainstreamed. Everybody sees the need for other sectors to be mainstreamed. Okay. Are there any other questions at this stage? There's room for one final question. Two, if you keep it both very small, very quick.
Hello, my name is Jill Baggerman, and I have more something in the form of comments. But first off, I want to say thank you for the summary of all of this, and I apologize to the people who didn't get to hear the sessions, because the narratives and the examples really colored a lot of the summary that we heard here. But two things that I think need to be further addressed is, one, as we talk about power imbalances being a major challenge and participatory practices being a part of the initial stages and continued process, we are not taking into full account that even at the grassroots level and throughout the system, there continue to be power imbalances that need to be addressed, and included parties need to be present at every stage. Another thing that I have that's more in the form of a question is, we speak a lot this week about the bottom-up and the top-down meeting, but we've barely spoken at all of some of the institutional mechanisms at the middle levels and how to further develop them and how to target that center stage to move both down and up. So if you can address that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I will quickly bring back the microphone. We have one other. Whom can I give the floor first?
Oh, yes.
No, Lens?
Let's give a quick response to Lesja. Yes, certainly the list is not exhaustive. There are even more people missing, actually, the water users who are not on the list. We all water users, of course, but those groups, and it was also mentioned by you, sir, that this specific group we were talking about all the time wasn't represented in our sessions. So that's one thing we should think about when organizing a follow-up conference on this topic. Mm-hmm. With regard to whether we should be in the place of the politicians and say what they have to do, I think we can have a nice discussion or debate about how to influence or improve the functioning of the political system, but I have no answer yet on your question with regard to that. I'm a little bit lost on what, Katrina, you wanted to ask with regard to power imbalances and addressing the middle levels. I think, yes, they are important, but... Mm-hmm.
So the question is also perhaps how to define this middle level, what it is actually about. Huh?
So, for instance, the government at the state, provincial, and city level.
Well,
I think, one first step would be to create opportunities for meeting all of these groups and stakeholders. And that was also one of the conclusions, that we can team up and exchange views and to learn from each other's interests. I think that's the first important stepping stone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Do you want to give a reaction?
Yeah, I maybe could comment on the SDG. A very interesting suggestion that perhaps other sectors should have targets within a water goal. I'd never heard that idea before, and I'm not sure if it's a good idea. I think that what I would like to see is one way or the other, that it's clear that water security is the key to tackle many of the other goals. So water security is the key to the climate agenda. It's the key to to food security. It's a big part of tackling disaster risk reduction, and so on. So whether you can achieve that better by having those targets under the water goal, or vice versa, I don't know. But somehow that message needs to become clear.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Did you? The final words.
Well,
Session.
To answer the first part of your question on connectivity, I have nothing to say except it's like motherhood. Nobody can disagree. On the first part of your question about telling the politicians that unless you do what we experts have to tell you is the right thing to do, you don't get our votes. I'm afraid that's not going to work. Because in a democracy, you don't weigh the votes, you count them, and you're not nearly numerous enough. You've got extremely high quality and probably very low quantity, so I'm afraid the politician wins. He wins because he's a politician. He's a professional politician. You're a professional water person, each to his own. Mm-hmm. Convince the other. And I don't think demonizing one or the other works. The politician saying this chap walks in with his jargon and models and his analysis, and where does he come from? The moon. Shakespeare wrote about water on the moon, by the way, and vice versa. I mean, there was a journalist who wrote that a statesman is a dead politician. We need more statesmen. So, you know, instead of setting up that confrontation, I think everybody would agree to go back to the motherhood bit, connectivity, and engaging each other. And, I mean, it takes a crisis sometimes to do it. The last conference organized by IUC and Gopal Gandhi, who's Gandhi's grandson, by the way, was one of the speakers, and he said he was hopeful of 2 years of drought globally so that people would understand the importance of water. I mean, we don't want a drastic solution like that, but you get the idea. Politics in command means really that, I'm talking of democracies, flawed they may be, but they're democracies. They represent the people. You cannot, I mean, in India, you can't have a referendum on everything. It'll take you about 10,000 years to get the vote of 1.2 billion people. So you have representatives of people who represent, if not a total consensus, a majority consensus of the country, and you have to legally understand that at the end of the day, in a transboundary kind of situation, they will be the ones who will sign. They will be the ones who will take the responsibility. And you will be the ones, the water people will be the ones who will guide them, who will tell them which is the right way to go, technically, legally, and whatever the multidimensional facets are.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to have one big round of applause for all the speakers, including the ones from the last session. Thank you so much.